The most dangerous question you'll ever answer isn't about
All right. Hello and welcome to our live stream tonight. I am the Tattooed Apologist, and we are talking about the embarrassment principle. We're back talking about the resurrection, and this is just continuing our ongoing series. Just a quick reminder to everyone that on the 22nd of this month, I am so blessed to have an opportunity to interview Dr. Gary Habermas. And you have seen his books not only on my shelf, but if you have ever looked into the resurrection, you have seen something by him. He is the world's foremost expert on the resurrection. I couldn't be more excited. I'm going to do my best not to fanboy during the interview, because I'm sure that would be the first person that's ever fanboyed during a resurrection interview. If you have questions, please drop them to me, and I'm going to try to compile all of them together and just get the absolute best information out of the limited time that we have with Dr. Habermas. So it's going to be a blast. And today we are going to talk about the embarrassment principle. So if you go back to our previous live streams, we have talked about swoon theory. We have talked about mass hallucination. We have talked about stolen body. And today we're talking about the embarrassment principle. So I appreciate you guys joining us. And as always, I would love to know where you're joining from. So drop it in the chat. Where are you watching or listening from? Hopefully it's as cool as some of the places we've had recently, like Hawaii and whatnot. And a couple little housekeeping things. If you are watching live, please hit the like button and share the stream with anyone else that you think this could be useful for. We're going to try something a little different today. Not only did I bring slides, so you guys could probably see already, I've got slides, so we'll see how that goes. And then, as always, I will answer questions throughout the course of the live stream to the best of my ability. And if you have other questions, I'm going to also just open it up at the end for a big Q&A session. So if you have questions, just throw them into the chat, and I'll either get to them at the moment or at the end. And last little housekeeping thing. I'm going to warn you guys, our dogs are back in the house. And so there is a decent chance at some point in time that either the German Shepherd or our cute little mutt will come up and be annoying. I apologize. There's no way to keep them guarantee that they're quiet. So all right, let's hop in. So we're going to examine the idea of the embarrassment principle today. It is one of the most compelling arguments for the historicity or the truth of Jesus's resurrection. When I say historicity, that is just a fancy term for is it accurate? Is it true? Did it actually happen in history? And that is the principle of embarrassment. And by the way, if you guys have a preference of me being the big, I don't know what you call this, the icon here, or if it's easier if I do that, let me know. I couldn't care less one way or another. Whatever is easier for you guys to read, just let me know. So the embarrassment principle, or the principle of embarrassment. What does this mean, and why is it important? And especially, why is it important for the resurrection? So what this principle actually suggests is that the gospel writers, and I even put up a great little banner for you guys here, the gospel writers they included details in all four of the Gospels, and the Gospels are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I put a little fun Bible trivia there for you. Gospel means good news in reference to the good news about Jesus Christ. And in all four of the Gospels, they include details that would be absolutely, totally, and utterly embarrassing to the early Christians and the early Christian church, and hence would be very counterproductive to the cause of growing Christianity. So these are the types of details, and we're going to go into them very specifically tonight, that you wouldn't invent because they would be embarrassing, and you wouldn't want to add them to your story if this is made up, because it's going to make it less likely that people will actually hear what you have to say, believe what you have to say, because it doesn't always look good at them, especially to an audience 2,000 years ago. So, and Jay Wortman, Jesus absolutely does love you, buddy. I promise you that. Even when life is tough, he absolutely still loves you. So what I think what's important with the embarrassment principle is to remember that it doesn't matter where you're at right now in your faith. You could be a committed Christian and absolutely crushing it in your walk. You could be a skeptic. You could be somewhere in between. It doesn't matter, because the way that we are going to approach this is with an open mind, and we are going to be clinical about how we diagnose and decide, does the embarrassment principle actually make sense relative to the facts that we have in evidence, and is it something that we should be able to rest our hat on? Or is it one of those things that you go, well, whatever, it's fine, it's, maybe it's kind of solid, maybe it's not. So let's go at this looking at the historical evidence and not just focusing on theological claims. And as always, I hope you get something out of this. Please don't take this and then beat your friend over the head, proverbially, with, oh, I just learned this and you're so dumb and I'm so smart now. That's not what this is for. we're always coming back to 1 Peter 3:15, talking all about having a defense of the faith, or your faith, but doing so with kindness and respect. So, but hopefully this will at least create opportunities for you to have really good conversations with people and explore your own faith. So I'll be clear up front on my position. And I absolutely think the embarrassment principle is, well, first of all, I think it's wild. Before I went to school to get my master's in Christian apologetics, I didn't even know this was a thing. And then I heard it the first time. I'm like, that seems like it actually makes a lot of sense. And then when I started digging in more and more, I'm like, holy moly, I couldn't even envision or imagine why you would do this, why you would intentionally embarrass yourself if you're a fledgling faith. And so we'll get into that. But I'm not going to prove anything to you tonight. I'm going to lay out the evidence. I'm going to answer the questions, and hopefully we have a great conversation about it, and we can weigh the historical argument on its merits rather than just on a plethora of other things. So our goal is to pursue truth wherever that leads. So I do have a roadmap because I am so on top of my slides tonight. So hopefully you're loving the slides. And our roadmap for tonight is that first we're going to explain what the embarrassment principle is in a little bit more detail and why historians use it. This is not a thing I came up with. This is not a thing that Christians came up with. This is a thing that historians use. This is a strategy, a method, a tactic that they use. Then we're going to examine the three major quote unquote embarrassing elements in the resurrection account. That's women as the first witnesses, the disciples' failure and their betrayals, and the shameful manner of Jesus's death by crucifixion. Then we're going to consider the counter arguments from skeptical scholars. And why are we going to talk about the counter arguments? Because apologetics is the defense of the faith. And to be able to defend the faith, you got to know what the other arguments are. And so this is where we're going to actually look at the other arguments. We're going to weigh it out, think of it like a little bit of a courtroom scenario, and we're going to decide what actually makes the most sense. Let's look at the arguments for the Christian faith. Let's look at the arguments against it in reference to the embarrassment principle. And then we're going to go ahead and we'll do our Q&A session. So I say we get started after I take a quick sip of coffee, and then we're going. All right, so here we go. First thing we're talking about, the embarrassment principle. And so the question is, what exactly is the principle of embarrassment or the embarrassment principle? And it stems from a strategy used by historians, and it's a criteria that they review and use to evaluate whether or not a claim is likely authentic or not. And so that's kind of a lot of fancy words there. So the basic idea, though, is this: people don't invent stories that make themselves or their heroes look bad. And guess what? We actually see this all the time. And while we do like a little bit of self-deprecation, look at almost any movie that you watch today that has a hero or a superhero in it. And there's an arc where, yeah, they have the hero's journey. They have a little bit of a negative thing happen, but they always persevere, and they never really look that bad. And so, that, especially in something that's real world. Right now, in real world, we're talking about the faith. We're talking about people that are going to their martyr death for Christ. That their entire world has been turned upside down. And so they have every reason in the world to leave out the details that are embarrassing. And before anybody hops off and gets angry and thinks I'm misogynistic, I'm not the one that says, and we'll talk about it, I'm not the one that says women discovering the empty tomb is embarrassing. We are talking about a Jewish culture under Roman authority 2,000 years ago, and how they treated and judged women at that period of time. So we'll get to that. This is don't shoot the messenger, please, in this one. So when we find accounts that include embarrassing details about the author or about their cause, historians generally consider these details a lot more likely to be authentic. And we've already started answering this question, but basically, embarrassing elements would have been a lot easier to just leave out of the story, especially if it was fictional. And I think for us, we can all understand this, that if we go back to our guiding principle that we've been talking about, which is the 3 L's, right? Coming from C.S. Lewis, that Jesus is either a liar, he's a lunatic, or he's Lord. So if he's a liar or he's a lunatic, and the disciples knew that Jesus did not do what he said he did, that he did not rise from the grave, it would make all the sense in the world to lie and omit all the yucky stuff, all the embarrassing stuff, all the stuff that isn't flattering. However, if he is Lord and what he said did come true, and they did experience the post-resurrection glory of Jesus, that becomes the period of time where you start to say, you know what? I don't think I should lie about this. I don't think it's a good idea for me to omit things, because I've already been told, to be honest, I've already been told what I'm to do by the risen Lord, who I saw post-resurrection in his glorified state. And I don't think now's the time to start picking and choosing what I'm going to do relative to this account of Jesus's life and his ministry. And so you can imagine that would really be a difficult thing for them to do if Christ is Lord. And it would be really strange that they didn't do that if Christ was a liar or if he was a lunatic. And again, this is a broadly used approach to historical research, not just in the Bible. So In fact, I'll give you an example. Roman historians typically would give a lot more will give a lot more credence or a lot more trust and accolades to an account where the emperor would admit failures or show weakness. But most of the imperial propaganda is, you know, typically would avoid anything that was unflattering or didn't make them look the best. And I don't know about you guys. Drop it in the chat. Does this remind you of any country right now? Because I can think of a certain, and it could be a few countries, uh, but I could. There's one that I'm just like it. It just sounds so much like, and uh, to me, I think that's North Korea. And you think about the fact that when you look at some of the stories that you've heard from there, and who knows, maybe they are propaganda, but you think about like, yeah, I think it was Kim Jong Il back before he passed on. It was like they were talking about, he played a round of golf and he shot 18, and he only bowled one game and he bowled a 300. It's like these absolutely ludicrous uh, ideas, and so that would be that type of of imperial propaganda that doesn't actually make any sense and doesn't actually isn't actually a valid approach. Uh, but we see the same things in ancient Rome as we do today with propaganda. So why would it be any different? But for historians, that's actually important. That is important when they're not seeing and when they're not reading things that do look like propaganda and do look like they're just sanitized to make somebody that's in power look good or look better than they actually are. So it's important to understand that the embarrassment principle doesn't prove something is true beyond all doubts. It's just, it really suggests that certain elements are more likely to be true than not true and less likely to have been invented given a certain scenarios. So it's just a tool in the toolkit. It's not a silver bullet, and nor should we treat it like a silver bullet. When we apply it to the resurrection accounts, proponents will argue that the gospel contains several elements that would have been embarrassing or very counterproductive for the early Christians and the early Christian church to invent. And so, and so, look at that! I got my third slide up. I am crushing it today. I love it. Uh, except I put up the wrong one. Well, that's what I get for getting excited. So, our three embarrassment elements that historians agree unilaterally, or essentially ubiquitously, that women as the first witnesses to the empty tomb and resurrection appearances would have been embarrassing due to uh, the cultural norms and the way that women were treated and where the stature they had in society. Number two, undoubtedly, would be the disciples' cowardice, their doubt, and their betrayal. And three is the crucifixion itself, because it was a shameful form of execution that was only reserved for the wretches of society, and typically that would include insurrectionist slaves and people that they wanted to see that any sort of insurrection or mutiny against the groups in power would be met with extreme torture and a really horrible way to die. So I think of it. It was pretty effective in that sense. So and remember to keep dropping your questions in the chat for the Q&A at the end. And also, if you guys haven't seen it already, we did a Who is Jesus video series today. And the first video went out at 5. There was one at 5, 6, 7, 8, and then another one will be at 10, 11, 12, and 1. So there's a total of 8. They're all about a minute or less. So take a look at that on YouTube. So let's talk about women as the first witnesses. So all 4 gospels. Nope, still didn't get the right one. There we go. All right. All 4 gospels agree that women were the first to discover Jesus's empty tomb. And in some of the accounts, the first to see the risen Christ, right? The risen post resurrection Christ. And while I think this is incredibly unremarkable for us in 2025, because we don't that would not have any level of of issue for us from a legal standing, from a cultural standing. Um, but in first century Jewish and Roman society, this is a striking detail. And again, not this isn't me saying this. Don't shoot the messenger. But we literally have. I'm going to pull up a quote from Josephus. So Josephus is a Jewish historian, and Rome actually enlisted him to write a history of the Jews. And so this is what he said. He said, "But let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of the levity and boldness of their sex." So, uh, this obviously reflects the cultural attitude towards women, women's testimony, women in court, although they weren't even allowed to be in court. So this is if you're an objective observer, this is bad for Christianity. This is bad for the faith. You're a fledgling faith. You're making a radical claim, an absolutely radical claim. You're saying Jesus died, he was crucified, he came back to life. You're saying the tomb is empty and he didn't swoon. You're saying the body wasn't stolen. You're saying it wasn't a mass hallucination. And then your evidence is that women discovered the empty tomb and saw him first post resurrection, even though we don't accept women's testimony to be admitted in court or in society. So that would be, if you're really playing it out as an objective observer, that would be a horrible way to attempt to get your fledgling faith to have to strike a match and get going. For us, it's no big deal. In 2025, wouldn't matter if it was if men or women that discovered it, but women's testimony was considered unreliable and was inadmissible, or at very best, most charitably, exceptionally discounted in Jewish and Roman courts. So, this is not the way you would start it. If you're going to make something up, this is not the thing you start with to make up. In fact, there was a second century critic of Christianity named Celsus, not Celsius, but Celsus. And he also, just like Josephus, mocked the women's testimony because of their quote unquote because they are hysterical, and not like haha funny, talking about being emotionally, unhinged and unable to, to present themselves appropriately. Again, 2025, that's ludicrous, and I think we could all agree on that. But we're talking about 2,000 years ago in a culture that is fundamentally different than the culture that we live in today. So I don't know about you guys, but if I were an early Christian and I were fabricating a resurrection story to maximize its credibility, no question I would have had a male disciple discover the empty tomb. And I think that's pretty obvious, based off of women's standings 2,000 years ago. And, instead, this is, again, just one of the scandalous natures of the gospel is all four, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all four of the gospels, women are the first witnesses. So they didn't care. And again, doesn't prove that it's true, but boy, that seems to be a lot more likely to be true than untrue. And there are scholars like N.T. Wright, and I would highly recommend if you've never read, if you wanted to read a cool book or read from an author that is an excellent scholar and doesn't try to write way above way above your head. N.T. Wright would be a great one. I'd start with Dr. Habermas, of course, but he's excellent. And N.T. Wright does a very nice job of arguing that the women women discovering the empty tomb is compelling evidence for the historical reliability. So I think it's at least worth, considering. And let me pull this down so you guys can see this. And there you go. This is N.T. Wright, who I was talking about in the bottom left corner. And he said, this is, in fact, one of the most powerful pieces of evidence for the gospel tradition being substantially reliable. One thing you guys will probably notice as well is that it's very rare that historians, theologians, people that that are working in trying to understand things from long ago, they rarely talk in absolutes the way that I think we have a tendency to. If you guys have kids, you certainly know that kids talk in absolutes all the time. Like, oh, my dad, you never let me do this. You always make me do that, which is like almost never the case. But historians tend not to use that same level of absolutes throughout the way that they speak. So I think that's important to keep in mind. So for us, there are several counterpoints for us to consider because we want to look at both sides of the argument, which is, perhaps the women discovering the tomb, maybe it was already well known in the community. And so because that was already well known, that would make it impossible to change it, because then somebody could call it out and say, no, that's not true. That's not what's been what I've already heard. So that's possible. Maybe another counterpoint could be that the male disciples needed to be absent for some theological reasons, or maybe they were still just hiding in fear. And that, of course, will go to the next embarrassment principle. And I think the third counterpoint could be that women's testimony actually serves some sort of a literary purpose in the narrative. In the comments, I'd love to hear what you guys think. In your opinion, do you think one of the counterpoints makes more sense? Do you think that it makes more sense that is such a shockingly or strikingly poor thing to have happen if you're trying to craft a story? Do you actually think that women discovering the tomb is such an embarrassing principle to 2,000 years ago's the early Christian church that it's probably more true than not true? And I'd love to hear what you guys think in the chat. And now we're going to talk about the disciples' failures and the betrayals. So the second embarrassing element is the betrayal of Jesus's disciples, the future leaders of the church. And were they brave? And were they strong? And were they resolute? They were not at this point, at least. At this point in time, they were doubting. They were fearful. They were, in Peter's case, he denies Christ 3 times. So this is not a good group of strong, courageous people at this point. Of course, we know that they absolutely change fundamentally once they meet the resurrected Christ in his glory, in his resurrected state. But I think it's important to call those out, right? So if you have your Bible open, if you go to Mark 14, that's when Peter denies Jesus 3 times. That's 14:6. I'm sorry, that's Mark 14:66 through 72. You have the disciples fleeing when Jesus is arrested. That's Mark 14:50. You got Thomas, good old doubting Thomas, who doubts the resurrection and says, I'm not going to believe it. I'm not going to believe that Christ has been resurrected until I see the holes in his hands from the nails, and I can touch the holes in his hand. That's John 20, 24 through 29. And the disciples failing to understand Jesus's predictions of his death and resurrection. That's Mark 9:32. So a little bit of extra, biblical knowledge there for you. So if the early church was creating legendary accounts, don't you think it would make sense that they would portray their leaders just like a bit more heroically? Because I don't know about you, but that does not the portrayal I gave you here, and this is just a small smattering of the disciples. It doesn't they don't look very good. And I want everybody to be honest because I'll just call myself out first. No question, I do this, and I still do this, and I'm embarrassed that I do. Who here has ever read something in scripture, and well, maybe we'll just pick on the disciples right now, and said something to this effect? Well, you know what? If I had been there, if I had walked on water like Peter, then yeah, I never would have denied Christ after that. Or, if I had done this, if I'd seen the things they've seen, I would never, because I have done that. Uh quite a lot. So it is a I think it's easy to do. But that said, uh you know, this is not if you are writing either about yourself or you're writing about the early church and this faith that you want, unless you're writing the truth, and that means you have to call yourself out and call yourself out for the silly things that you do, then you definitely don't write it that way. You're going to want to write it a lot more flattering for yourself. Uh, and and Jay Wartman, we will well let's sync up on that because I think uh, the Bible can be very confusing. But if you take a systematic approach to reading it, then it can be it can make a lot more sense. And also, depending on the translation that you're reading, it may I don't know if when you open the Bible, if you're reading like King James or something like that, it can be very difficult to read. And so you may want to be looking for a translation that is much simpler, more modern day English, and use that as a way to try to grasp some of the concepts. But we actually one of the later this week we're going to talk about what is the Bible, and we're going to talk about how do we properly read the Bible. So that would be an awesome one also for you uh to show to show up for. Yeah, no, learning disabilities are difficult. Uh if you can't tell already, I'm an ADHD kid, so I struggle to keep it focused on any one thing at any one point in time. So I get that, but definitely join for that video as well, or for that live stream in that video. Um, so the disciples, they are consistently portrayed as slow to understand, very quick to doubt, and constantly abandoning Jesus. So especially in his hour of need. So this is not a portrayal you'd want. In fact, this is not a portrayal you would want today. If somebody said to you today, like, you know, how would you describe me? If somebody said, hey, how would I describe you? And they're like, well, I think you are slow. I think you easily abandon me in my time of need. You pretty much doubt everything I say, and you don't really understand anything I'd say. I mean, that is like a really rough go of it. So that I wouldn't want to write that about myself. That's that's for sure. Uh, so I think again, when we're considering does does it make sense that the authority figures of the early church are going to actively go out of their way, if they're covering a lie, to then also create really unflattering, really unfortunate things to be said about themselves? I mean, that seems less likely uh, to happen, because it also undermines the credibility of their own leadership. because these guys are going to be the leaders. And so, could you imagine? I mean, one, I think we probably, at least I got to work on my ego a lot. Uh, but I think, we like a little bit of self deprecation from leaders. But if you're at your church, just imagine your church. I'm trying to think of, I mean, one, I couldn't even imagine my pastor ever saying this, but I couldn't imagine if my pastor was like, "Hey guys, um, I I I constantly doubt and leave Jesus, um, and I am yeah I don't follow through on what I need to do, and I really don't understand pretty much most of this, and yeah, but I want to be your leader." You're like, what? I don't think I don't. I mean, you should be at church, but I don't think you should be the leader of the church. So I mean, they're undermining their own credibility as the leader of the new church, you know. And so I think such an unflattering portrayal really suggests a certain level of historical authenticity, and frankly, the gospel writers, all of them did it, were compelled to include these very embarrassing details. And if it, I just can't really fathom a reason why they would why they would do that if it didn't actually happen. But I'm open for it. If you guys have any ideas, drop it in the chat. Let me know if you think there is a reason why they would do that, even if they're making it up, they're covering a lie, but they think the way to do that is to undermine their own credibility. Uh, I would be interested to hear it. There are skeptical scholars who have pointed out some counterpoints uh, that the failures of the failures of the disciples could serve a theological purpose. So one, it could highlight Jesus's fidelity in contrast to human weakness. So they're saying, although Jesus did that all on his own, but they're saying uh, maybe they're actually better off than they were, but they really wanted to make Jesus look esteemed and really hold him in the highest regard. So I mean, maybe. Uh, Two is it could create even more drama and whatever the equivalency of like FOMO was 2000 years ago, and like people now really want redemption because they can see the drama around how great Christ was, how uh kind of crappy the disciples were at periods of time relative to it, or in relation to or in comparison to Christ. And and so maybe it would drive people wanting to be Christians. Again, that seems a little circumspect, but okay. And the third main argument or counter argument is that they make the disciples more relatable to ordinary believers. And I think that would make sense today. I don't that I struggle with that one because if you're thinking about this uh if you're thinking about this fledgling faith 2000 years ago, everything that's happened, you are under immense persecution. Christians are being killed left and right uh by the Roman emperor. I don't know that relatability is what you're really going for at that point. Today, I think a lot of us like relatability because, I mean, I think we've all heard people talk about even politicians at times, like, oh, you know what? I feel like I could have a beer with that guy. And it's like, I don't know why you want to be, I don't know why we want our politicians to be relatable, but I could imagine today we'd like the disciples to be relatable, or certainly we sometimes do that with Jesus inappropriately. But I don't know that that really works uh, you know, for 2000 years ago. I just don't I don't know. But let me know if you guys think it does. Drop it in the chat because I'm always down to hear thoughts and to talk through it. Um so what should we consider, or additionally, I think we should consider whether these portrayals were actually embarrassing by the time the gospels were written. And because and this goes into the live stream if you're a part of uh, the legendary hypothesis. It's important to understand, a bit of the timeline. And I have a wonderful timeline graphic. Oh, let me pull it up here. Uh, Here we go. So, so I think it could be easy for somebody to say, well, if this happened, in 33 AD, and then the gospel wasn't written until 70 AD, maybe they're dead, or by that point in time they don't really care anymore. So you could see, you could see where maybe that would be the case. The problem is, as you're looking here, Jesus dying between 30 and 33 AD or CE, technically, and then you look at the oral tradition, which is from 30 to 70. And, we look at Mark, which many people think is the first gospel written. There's not nearly enough time for a legend to be formed during that period of time. It's still a highly oral tradition in that community. And, you know, it's not enough time for even for those embarrassing elements to have just sort of, you know, popped in in because you still have so many people alive at that period of time that could have said, yes, that happened. No, it didn't happen. And that's the problem when you have or that's the problem for people that are arguing against the idea of the truth of scripture, because when it comes to the legend hypothesis is that there's not enough time that passes, and there's still too many people that were still alive and could very easily say, "Yeah, that happened," or "No, it didn't happen." So that brings us to the crucifixion as a deeply shameful death. So I think this might be perhaps the most significant of all the embarrassing elements in the crucifixion itself. And why is that? Because in the ancient world, crucifixion was not just a painful death. It was torture. And we all you have to do is go back to the swoon theory live stream that we did. And when we went through the medical journal that described what actually happened, it is awful. So not only is it torture, it is deliberately humiliating, and it's shameful. And that is that would not be the way that you would build a lot of credibility in if for the fact that your leader, in this case Christ, was anything other than a an insurrectionist slave that got caught and then got crucified to scare off any other thoughts of insurrection. So that's not a great way to start. In fact, the very word cross, you know, should be far removed not only from the person of a Roman citizen, but from his thoughts, his eyes, and his ears. A very famous person said this quote, it's from Cicero. Even if you've never been in any kind of an ancient sort of a class, you've probably heard of the name of Cicero before. And he's making the point that that cross, the whole word, the concept, it carried serious stigma to with it. It was not what you wanted to be a part of, and it's not a not a pleasant thing to be a part of. And so I'm going to pull up my Logos Bible software. By the way, if you don't use this, I would highly encourage looking at it. I think it's the best Bible software. Um, and if we go to Deuteronomy 21:20, 21:23, and again, think about when Deuteronomy was written hundreds of years before Christ was crucified. And it says, his body shall not remain all night on the tree, but you shall bury him the same day. For a hanged man is cursed by God. You shall not defile your land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance. So anyone hung on a tree is under God's curse. That's right here. anyone hanged on a tree is under God's curse. All right. So you go, okay, maybe that was just a kind of a one and done. All right. Well, how about Galatians 3:13? This is Paul, the apostle Paul, and he says, oops, uh, I'm breaking the logos. All right. And he says, Christ Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree. So Paul is now referring to crucifixion as a curse. So, even in the early Christian confessions, which, if we go to 1 Corinthians 1:23, it says, and again, this is Paul saying, but we preached Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. This raises a compelling question, which, and let me pull this off the screen and put this back up for you guys. Where'd it go? Oh, here we go. Uh, pulls pulls up a compelling question. If early Christians were inventing a story about the Messiah, which is what somebody that wouldn't believe in Christ. Oh, Castlemore, what's up? Thanks for hopping on. It's okay that you're a little late. I'm just glad you're here. That's awesome. So this raises a compelling question. If early Christians were inventing a story about their Messiah, why would they choose the most shameful form of execution possible? Again, at best, he is a caught insurrectionist slave, and that's the best case scenario. So what would be the benefit of having Christ be crucified if you're making it up? Why not have him die heroically, or I don't know, mysteriously ascend to heaven without dying? And I come back to even our modern day movies that we like to watch, and sometimes you do have the protagonist, right, the main character die, but when they die, they do die heroically. They're doing something that is, yeah. I'm thinking of multiple movies, but I don't want to ruin the movies for you guys if you've not seen them. But like, I'm thinking about the one Avengers movie. I won't say more. I won't ruin it. But somebody, if you're going to die as the protagonist, you're going to die in a heroic way, not the worst possible way you could die. And not only is it the worst way you could die, it's also the most shameful way that you would die, because it says something about you and who you were in the society. And it's, from that perspective, it's all bad. So I think, I would argue that crucifixion is included because it happened. The early Christians, they couldn't deny the crucifixion because it was a public execution. So, it's true. So they wrote it. But there are people that have counterpoints to that. Their point, there are three again. The first is, by the time the Gospels were written, Christians had already developed a theological interpretation around crucifixion. So they basically, what that means is, Christ was crucified. They had to wordsmith it into a positive. So that would be that particular idea. The second would be that a shameful death creates a certain tension in the narrative of Christ, that the resurrection is even more triumphant because of the fact that it was such a shameful death. And the third is that the gospel would be diminished if it wasn't a shameful death, because Jesus ultimately has control over the situation. So why not have the most shameful death? Because ultimately he is the King of Kings, and he'll be king over and have control over that situation as well. So, what's particularly interesting in is how the early Christian church transformed the symbol of shame into the central symbol of Christianity. I mean, I'm thinking like, I don't know how many people here, but like I've got a cross necklace on, right? So, this is representing, uh, the most, as we've been talking about, the most shameful way to be killed or murdered, executed in ancient Rome. I think a lot of us have cross tattoos, uh, and so essentially, rather than hiding the crucifixion, it's become the center of our faith. And you know, so the question is, does this transformation undermine the embarrassment principle, or does it highlight the historical reliability that ultimately we're considering? So this is, what I've got on the screen now are the counter arguments from skeptical scholars. And since we've examined the main embarrassing elements, I think it's fair to consider some of the broader critiques of the embarrassment principle. So hopefully you guys can all see that. Oh, let me take this down so you guys can see this better. Okay. Um, the first major critique is that the principle essentially involves circular reasoning. And and basically it's, how do we know what would have been embarrassing to early Christians? And and the answer is largely from the texts themselves. And so the argument is that could create a potential logical loop. Because if you're getting all the information from the source text itself, then you're essentially getting yourself into a feedback loop, or what would be called a circular reasoning. Second is that critics argue that these supposedly embarrassing elements, they all actually serve the narrative and have theological purposes, i.e., the women as first witnesses creates a powerful reversal narrative. You've got disciples' failure that highlights the theme of grace and redemption, and the crucifixion sets up the extremely dramatic and triumphant return of Christ, through the resurrection. Third would be that skeptical scholars point out that we don't actually have access to earlier oral traditions that preceded the written gospels. So the embarrassing elements might have already been incorporated into the tradition by the time the gospels were written. By the way, this is not actually pop. I just want everybody to know. I have one of those fizzy water things. It was a great investment. Highly recommend those. Uh, so, uh, the fourth is scholars like Bart Ehrman, and we've talked about Bart Ehrman before, and he is a New Testament scholar, and he's a contemporary. He's still alive. At least I think he's still alive, still writing books. And but he doesn't believe in the lordship of Jesus Christ, even though he is a New Testament scholar. And he's one of the few that don't. But he basically says that the Gospels were written primarily for internal Christian audiences, not necessarily as apologetic texts for outsiders. And, so that might change what we would consider embarrassing to more of instructive for the community. And finally, you'd have proponents of more of, sort of mystical or mystic. Between yesterday with the Nicolaitans and today with mythicist. I'm just struggling with certain words. Mythicist theories argue that the entire embarrassment principle ultimately assumes a historical Jesus when they believe Jesus was a mythical figure from the start. Now, I would highly encourage you to go back to, if that's where you're at, I would highly encourage you to go back to some of our live streams on the resurrection, because guys like Bart Ehrman, who don't believe that Jesus is Lord, say it is undeniable that Jesus walked the earth. He is a person. He was certainly crucified, and and so I think that one is, of all of those, is probably the least strong and most minority view uh, and really doesn't represent much of a challenge to the embarrassment principle. And there are some, there are some middle ground approaches as well. I think I have them on here. Yep, middle ground. So there are some more of the middle ground perspectives. That's the bottom blue box there if you're looking. Um, you'll have moderate scholars suggest that while the embarrassment principle, it doesn't it doesn't prove the resurrection, it does suggest the gospel writers were working with traditions they just couldn't simply discard or modify at will. And these elements ultimately indicate a certain historical, you know, core historical ideas within the Christian narrative that ultimately the details were shaped by certain theological concerns of the early church. So, I think that's those are reasonable. Um, I think that brings us back to where does that leave us? So, is the embarrassment principle fact? Is it fiction? Uh, you know, and ultimately, when it comes to the resurrection, and as we're getting ready, if anybody has any questions, I would love to answer any of them. I think when you consider the embarrassment principle and you think about the evidence that the gospel writers were working with certain traditions that they were treating with a high level of respect, uh, even though they looked really bad for them personally. You know that that doesn't really necessarily speak to that seems to speak well to Christianity in 2025. I'm not sure that speaks well to Christianity in 35 or 45 AD when you are being persecuted beyond what we could envision today. You are, you are a minority, a small group of people. You are living in places with the Roman Empire that is massive. They are polytheistic. You're living in a Jewish community that is not happy with you and thinks that you are an aberrant or heretical sect that has left traditional Judaism. And you are, if you're trying to fabricate something, it seems like the only way that effectively works in that particular area in that particular time period is to say Christianity is the bee's knees, baby. Like there is nothing better than this. Like all the things are good. If you come be a Christian, everything's going to be good. But that's not the context that we have. Instead, it's no. We're gonna tell you a lot of really embarrassing things about ourselves, and we're going to tell you amazing things about Christ and how we saw him. And we're going to do this. And we realize that it could very well cost us our lives. And we've talked about the fact that it did cost all the disciples their lives, except for John, uh, who wrote Revelation. And quick pitch, we will be back on Revelation tomorrow night at 9 o'clock uh, Arizona time for decoding Revelation chapter 3. But all the other disciples died horrible deaths, whether crucifixion, being sawed alive, being stoned, being filleted alive. It was a bad deal. So there's not a lot of things that are compelling to a random person in the Roman Empire at this point in time, going like, wait, so you guys are not even that good of leaders, from the gospel accounts. You're telling me you want me to put my life on the line for this thing? Like, what's the proof? Why would I want to do that? And I think when you go, because it's true, like I wouldn't write this about me if it wasn't true. I wouldn't put my life on the line if I hadn't seen the risen Christ. I wouldn't do this. It wouldn't make any sense. I would just go back to my life. I would go back to being a Jew. I'd go back to, you know, polytheism, whatever it is. And so again, the embarrassment principle doesn't prove something, but boy, I just don't think within the context of of that day and time, I don't think it makes any sense to go the route of embarrass yourself greatly and make and tell people pretty much all the bad things, minus Christ crucified and him in his resurrected and glorified state. So uh, that's when the truth truly is the most transformative testimony and the most compelling uh, of of any of any of the available options. So, um, but whether or not you think uh, that this helped really prove to you that the resurrection is true or not, I encourage you to engage these historical questions honestly, because faith shouldn't it faith your faith shouldn't be afraid of historical investigation, and skepticism shouldn't dismiss evidence that may challenge certain preconceived notions or presuppositions. So, uh, we're seeking truth. Um, so, does anybody have any questions? I've got my live stream chat open here. I got my Instagram chat up over here. Does anybody have any questions or any thoughts regarding maybe their perception being different now that they understand the embarrassment principle a little better? Or did I just explain it so well that everybody's like, nope, no, it's now I'm crystal clear on exactly how this is. All right. Well, I guess I must have been that crystal clear. Well, if you guys end up having any questions, drop me a DM on Instagram or put feel free to put a comment below the live stream. Oh, really? You've never heard of it? The before castle mode? That's I'm glad then you got a chance to hear about it tonight. It I hadn't heard about it either before. I think you joined later, so I was saying before I went and got my master's in Christian apologetics, I had never heard about it either. And the first time I heard it, I was like, "Is that really like a thing?" And then once I started uh, learning more and more about it, uh, especially the fact that this is a practice used throughout or used by all historians, it was uh, it was very eye opening for me. And and Jay Wortman, yeah, yeah. Well, I appreciate you being here, even though you're half asleep. That's that's nice. I'm glad, and ultimately, hopefully, you got something from it. Uh, anyways, um, so we'll be back tomorrow night, unless we have any other questions or thoughts. We'll be back tomorrow night at 9, decoding Revelation chapter 3. Check out at so about 2 minutes ago, another one of the Who is Jesus shorts dropped. There'll be another dropping at 11, another at 12, another at 1. Don't stay up for them, but check them out in the morning. They're all part of a playlist called Who is Jesus. They're all about a minute long or less. And then I think tomorrow we'll also be dropping Do I Hate God Part 2 and Christ Isn't Jesus's Last Name. If you guys, last announcement too. I also talked to Dr. Shep, who was my favorite professor in all three of my master's programs, and he has also agreed to come on and do an interview with us. He is an apologist and a pastor, and so we are scheduling an interview for June. So just like that Dr. Habermas interview later this month on the 22nd, if you check out Dr. Shep's book. He actually has a couple books. His first name is Andrew. But if you guys have any questions for him too, I mean, he's a real live apologist uh, that this is what he does, spends his days day in, day out, along with being a pastor. So I would, any questions you guys have, send them my way, because I want to make sure that's a super fruitful time as well. So, all right. Well, thank you guys. Have a really blessed rest of the night, and I will see you guys tomorrow at 9 Arizona time. Be blessed.
Our culture has mastered the art of Jesus reduction. We shrink wrap the Lion of Judah into a personal happiness coach. We've rebranded the King of Kings as a divine therapist. We've photoshopped the consuming fire into a warm spiritual blanket. The left turns Jesus into a socialist revolutionary who never mentions sin. The right turns him into a flag-waving patriot who's suspiciously obsessed with their political platform. Progressives claim him as history's first LGBTQ ally. Traditionalists refashion him as the enforcer of their cultural preferences. Everyone wants Jesus on their team as long as he plays by their rules. But what if the real Jesus is wilder, more dangerous, and more beautiful than any of these counterfeits? Check out part 3, The Cosmic Christ.